Hello, and welcome to Early and Often, the history of elections in America. Episode 5, The Plundering Time. Last time, we talked about the Chesapeake Bay in the 1630s. That decade saw the founding of Catholic-friendly Maryland just north of Virginia. Maryland's legislature was created and it slowly began to converge on Virginia's model. And Virginia's hostile relationship with Maryland led to changes in both colonies, with the forced expulsion of Governor Harvey in Virginia and a mini-war between the two provinces over Kent Island thanks to the prominent Virginian William Claiborne. Today, we're going to talk about the history of the Chesapeake in the 1640s, during the English Civil War. Now, during this period, the histories of Maryland and Virginia were intimately tied up with what was happening back in Britain, so I'm going to have to go into a bit of detail about English history here as well. It was a very complicated period and I'm not going to do it justice. If you are interested in finding out more, you can listen to Mike Duncan's excellent podcast Revolutions. The first episodes cover the English Civil War in much more detail than I can. And it wasn't really just an English Civil War. The conflict had its origins in Scotland and spilled over into Ireland as well, though we can mostly skip that side of things. But before we get to that, let's jump back a bit to talk briefly about the life of William Berkeley. His last name is spelled Berkeley, but pronounced Barkley. Berkeley was made governor of Virginia in 1642, and he would serve in that post for most of the next 35 years. During that time, the population of the colony jumped from 8,000 to 40,000, and it was under his leadership that Virginia really started to acquire a mature political culture. Berkeley was born in 1605, the fourth son of a quite distinguished family that had included many members of Parliament and even close associates of Queen Elizabeth. He was a very distant relative of the idealist philosopher George Berkeley. His father had been involved in the Virginia Company when he was young. Berkeley was smart and witty and, in fact, an occasional playwright. He became a moderately successful courtier in the 1620s and 30s, running errands for King Charles. At one point, the king granted him a 14-year monopoly on the sale of snow and ice as payment for his work. But he was unhappy and concerned for his future. His career hadn't progressed as quickly as he'd wanted, and he was always short on cash. I guess the snow and ice business wasn't as lucrative as he'd hoped. And he simply didn't like the king much on a personal level, though he was loyal to the monarchy. But perhaps even more importantly, in the late 1630s the political situation was destabilizing rapidly, and not in a way favorable to friends of the king. You'll recall that in episode 3 I talked about how Parliament and the monarchy were increasingly at odds over money. Kings needed more and more revenue, but Parliament controlled the purse strings and was increasingly willing to make its own demands. This caused particular problems under Charles I, who had been king since 1625. Charles was a fairly rigid and unbending man, and a believer in the divine right of kings. And unlike his father, James I, he was quite inept in his handling of Parliament. In his early reign, he repeatedly called and hastily dismissed parliaments when he kept not getting the results he wanted. He started to impose taxes without parliamentary approval, and in 1629 he simply stopped calling parliaments altogether, and even arrested some members who had opposed him. For the next decade, Charles ruled on his own, but he was constantly hampered by a lack of funds. The taxes he had levied without parliamentary approval were traditional ones, so he could at least claim some dubious legitimacy for them. But that meant that going even further would have been an even more serious break in precedent, one that could have caused a revolt. That Charles was unwilling to risk. So frugality was the order of the day. The monarchy put itself on a tight budget. But unfortunately for Charles, his ancestral home of Scotland proved his undoing. You see, unlike England, which had come through the Reformation with the Church only somewhat changed, in Scotland things had gone much further. The Scots had embraced a much more hardline, Calvinist faith, one that was far more skeptical of bishops and church hierarchy. Well, Charles's sympathies lay in the exact opposite direction. He liked the richness and order of the Anglican Church, which better suited his worldview. Charles attempted to move Scotland in a more Anglican direction, but the Scots would have none of it, and they revolted. The king's repeated attempts to suppress the uprising failed dismally, and he was soon seriously short on funds. Incidentally, Berkeley was present for these campaigns, though he showed no particular distinction. So, finally having no choice, in 1640, Charles called another parliament. It was that or bankruptcy. Needless to say, after a decade without convening, the House of Commons now had a very, very long list of grievances and demands, including the execution of one of the king's most trusted advisors. Charles, of course, resisted this, but over the next year his position deteriorated further. Meanwhile, Berkeley, assessing the situation, decided that the time had come to leave. He at first wanted to become ambassador to the Ottoman Empire, but changed his mind and secured the governorship of Virginia instead. The popular current governor, he was the man who'd replaced the hated Governor Harvey, was easily brushed aside. Berkeley had no experience in administration and few links to Virginia, and it's likely that he got the job mostly because Charles was so preoccupied with Parliament. He was of a much higher social class than pretty much everyone else in Virginia, which helped. In any case, Berkeley arrived in Virginia in early 1642 to take his new post. He was sworn in on the 8th of March and got to work. He hardly had a hectic schedule. Virginia was small and the government was rather minimal. He filled minor offices and approved land grants, that sort of thing. He did have to carefully manage the little factions that existed in the council. Remember, these were mostly the same men who had sent Governor Harvey packing 7 years ago. Berkeley at least wanted to avoid that sort of embarrassment. He met with the General Assembly, which still held its sessions in the Jamestown Church, much as it had 20 years ago. You'll remember, of course, that the General Assembly was still unicameral. The governor, councilors, and elected burgesses all sat and voted together. Berkeley saw here an opportunity. Because the council was so powerful relative to the governor, by siding with the burgesses, Berkeley could thereby enhance his own influence. So in that first session of the General Assembly, he aided the burgesses in various minor matters, while still taking care not to alienate the council. When elections were held the next year, they turned out very favorable towards Berkeley. We don't know when exactly the General Assembly became bicameral. It was certainly at some point during Governor Berkeley's reign, but that lasted 3.5 decades. However, there's a good chance that it happened early in 1643, during Berkeley's Second Assembly. So I'll just assume that's the case and talk about it here. At some point, the governor suggested that the council and burgesses begin meeting and voting separately. This would increase the power of the burgesses, since they now had a separate veto on legislation. The burgesses readily agreed to the change of course. The councilors took a little persuasion, but Berkeley won them over with some behind-the-scenes maneuvering. So that was that. The assembly now had 2 houses. The council became the upper house, and the lower house became known as the House of Burgesses. Note that people often call the General Assembly before this point the House of Burgesses as well, but that isn't really accurate. This gave Berkeley a much stronger counterweight to the council, and he made sure that the House of Burgesses was quite independent. He gave it the powers of the House of Commons and then some. Unlike the Commons, the burgesses could choose their own officers, which gave them much more control over their own agenda. As a result of all this generosity, the burgesses were generally loyal to Berkeley. If there were any big disagreements about this move, records of them haven't survived. Obviously, Parliament was already bicameral, so they had a working example. And really, it wasn't that big of a shift. It was just making concrete the gap that already existed between different members of the Assembly. But as I mentioned last week when discussing the creation of Maryland's bicameral assembly around the same time, it was an important step towards the standard American style of government. Meanwhile, in England, things had gone from bad to worse. Relations between Charles and his parliament broke down completely, and in August of 1642, war began. It wasn't a fight to the death at first. The king didn't want to destroy Parliament, or vice versa. Both sides just wanted to settle things in their favor. Commons wanted major reforms and an end to unauthorized taxation. Charles didn't want his authority diminished. But as the war dragged on for years, each side became more entrenched and more hostile to the other until there was no going back. This was a very confused situation. There were no clean dividing lines between the royalists and the parliamentarians. I mean, plenty of members of Parliament supported the king, after all. But you can still draw some generalizations. The supporters of King Charles, unsurprisingly, tended to be Anglicans who approved of the religious status quo. The stereotypical royalist was the cavalier, a dashing aristocratic type who only paid God lip service. On the other hand, Puritans tended to strongly support Parliament. They wanted the Church of England to more closely resemble the Calvinist austerity of Scotland rather than the other way around. The stereotypical parliamentarian was the Roundhead, a dour religious reformer with close-cropped hair. The people of Virginia, for the most part, were supporters of King Charles. There were few Puritans in the Chesapeake. Most of them had gone to colonize New England instead. There were some Puritan ministers here and there, who sometimes got expelled from the colony for religious nonconformity. But Virginia as a whole was not fiercely sectarian. They had come to make money, not out of religious passion. They were more worried about their trade being disrupted or property rights being lost than heresy. Berkeley himself had tried to impose a higher level of religious conformity upon his arrival in accordance with the king's wishes, but a few years later he reversed course and moved a bit more in the direction of toleration. Rather than rooting out nonconformist ministers himself, he left that decision to local communities. If the few Puritan groups wanted Puritan ministers, they could have them. So while Virginia as a whole very clearly sided with the Royalists and with the Church of England, they weren't die-hard ideologues. They were farmers and businessmen. In the various petitions and demands the Assembly sent back to England over the years, property rights and the regulation of the tobacco trade were always a much higher priority than anything else. So as England tore itself apart, they watched and they waited. But while the events unfolding in England were of great concern to the Virginians, they suddenly faced worse problems at home. Opichanacano, the Powhatan chieftain who had led that massacre against the English some 20 years ago, had never actually been removed from power. He still led his people, and he was still patiently biding his time. On April 18, 1644, a Christian religious holiday, he launched another massive attack on Virginia. While the last time 300 people had been killed, this time the count was 500, although that was a smaller percentage of the population. Still, it meant war yet again. An emergency meeting of the General Assembly was called to raise money and plan the colony's next moves. Berkeley himself returned to England to get more assistance. While he was away, William Claiborne was placed in charge of the militia. He was the guy last episode who'd failed to defend his claim on Kent Island against Maryland. But his hatred of Marylanders turned out to be pathological. So pathological, in fact, that he used the militia to settle old scores rather than deal with the far more pressing concern of Indian attacks. The events here are pretty confused, but I'll try to disentangle what happened as best I can. In Maryland, the English Civil War was perhaps even more concerning than in Virginia. The proprietor of the colony, Lord Baltimore, was a Catholic and a friend of the king, so Maryland stood to lose a lot should Parliament win. The Puritans were far more rabidly anti-Catholic than the Royalists, so religious toleration in Maryland was at stake, along with the property rights of the Catholic landlords. And within the colony itself, the Protestant-Catholic truce was under strain. There were repeated disagreements and arguments between the two sides, minor but worrisome in such a small colony. But until the coming of Claiborne, tensions were manageable. Perhaps in part because Maryland was Royalist, Claiborne became a supporter of Parliament, which was unusual for a Virginian. Upon getting his commission to lead the militia against the Indians, he instead teamed up with an English captain/merchant named Richard Ingle, another supporter of Parliament, who had his own grudge against the colony. A few years back, Ingle had been charged by the Maryland government for high treason for denouncing Charles at the start of the Civil War. But Ingle had threatened to behead with an axe anyone who tried to arrest him, and he sailed away. The charges were basically dropped afterwards, but the bad blood remained. So Claiborne and Ingle now had both personal and ideological reasons to attack Maryland, plus the men and the ships to do it. Claiborne attacked and took back Kent Island, while Ingle sacked the capital, St. Mary's City, and overthrew the government. For 2 years the colony was plunged into a period of chaos known as the Plundering time. Claiborne and Ingle didn't bother to set up a new central government or anything, they simply let things fall apart. The governor, Leonard Calvert, had been in England during the attack, and upon his return he was forced to take refuge in Virginia. The acting governor was captured and sent back to England as a prisoner. Unfortunately, our records of this period are quite sparse, so all we really know is that, for a time, Maryland was dramatically unsettled. Berkeley returned from his trip to England the year after the invasion of Maryland. He had been largely unsuccessful in getting any support for his war against the Powhatan, as the Royalists were all too busy losing the war to send help or even to care much at all about Virginia. Seeing how badly the war effort in Virginia had gone, he removed Claiborne from command and took over personally. Under Berkeley, things went much better. The Englishmen raided villages and eventually captured and killed Opechanicono himself. That effectively ended the war. Setting a model for future relations between Native Americans and the U.S. government, the Powhatan were made wholly subservient vassals to the English, and their territory was reduced to a smaller reservation. But as more people flooded into Virginia, the reservation was overrun by more and more settlers until it became merely another part of the colony. This would lead to yet more war in a few decades' time, but for now, things were calm again. With the Indians suppressed, Governor Calvert was able to retake his province and restore Maryland's government, with assistance from Governor Berkeley and some hired soldiers. Claiborne was again forced from Kent Island. He doesn't appear to have suffered any real negative consequences for this or any other of his actions, and he still kept his high position in the Virginia government. But the instability wasn't over for Maryland yet, not by a long shot. Leonard Calvert, who had been governor of the colony since its founding a decade and a half ago, died in 1647. This caused a major problem. The colony was still in disarray with a reduced population, and it had no money to pay the soldiers who had been hired to retake the colony. They were soon growing restless, and mutiny was a serious possibility. Into this difficult situation stepped a fascinating figure, Margaret Brent. She was not only a woman, she was an unmarried woman, and one with substantial lands in the colony. A Catholic, she had come to Maryland in 1638, along with her sister, with the blessing of Lord Baltimore in England. This was all quite unusual, both for the time and especially for the place, but Brent managed to become a prominent figure in the colony nonetheless. And when Governor Calvert died, she was named as executor of his will. She had a difficult job. She was tasked with selling off his assets and lands to pay off the soldiers and with trying to keep the situation from boiling over. Hamstrung by various legal difficulties, she decided to make a bold move. She appeared before the General Assembly and demanded to be given not just one, but 2 seats for herself, one as a major landowner and the other as executor of Calvert's will. She hoped that would help her get things done. She was of course refused, despite her protests, but it's enough to earn her a mention in this podcast as the first woman in America to demand a spot in the legislature. Not an elected spot or anything, but still. In any case, it turned out that Governor Calvert's estates were insufficient to pay off the soldiers, so she also sold off some property of his brother, Lord Baltimore, without permission. That resolved the immediate crisis, but when Baltimore heard about this, he was furious. The Assembly sent a message defending her actions, but she had fallen out of favor. Soon, she and her family left Maryland for Virginia. She spent the rest of her days there, at a plantation named Peace, never marrying. But in Maryland, the situation had stabilized for now. Governor Calvert's replacement was himself soon replaced, at the order of Lord Baltimore, by William Stone, a Protestant. This may have been an effort to appease the parliamentary faction in England. Lord Baltimore had been spending his time during the Civil War trying very hard to hold on to his family's privileges and property, including Maryland. A Protestant governor would have been a good way to appease his potential opponents. After arriving in Maryland, Governor Stone soon invited several hundred Puritans living in Virginia to take refuge in more tolerant Maryland. This both increased the population and made it seem like Maryland's toleration wasn't just a cover for Catholic supremacy. But it also had the effect of making the Protestants the totally overwhelming majority in the colony, far more than before. And the Catholic leadership within the colony was disappearing, to be replaced by new Protestant officials. This would, in the end, help bring about the end of toleration for Catholics within a few decades. The open hand that Catholics had offered was not to be reciprocated. But at least for now, Maryland would remain religiously open. In 1649, Lord Baltimore promulgated an Act of Religious Toleration, the first of its kind in America. Although Maryland had always practiced toleration, the principle had never actually been codified in law until now. The Act stated that for the sake of the, quote, more quiet and peaceable government of this province, and the better to preserve mutual love and amity amongst the inhabitants thereof, no person or persons whatsoever within this province, professing to believe in Jesus Christ, shall from henceforth be any ways troubled, molested, or discountenanced, for or in respect of his or her religion, nor in the free exercise thereof. Basically, if you were a Christian who believed in the Trinity, that is, most Christians outside of a few fringe sects, you could worship as you pleased without interference. Those who denied the Trinity could be put to death, though. Incidentally, the law also encouraged Marylanders to avoid using insulting labels for each other, such as, quote, heretic, schismatic, idolater, Puritan, independent, Presbyterian, popish priest, Jesuit, Jesuited papist, Lutheran, Calvinist, Anabaptist, Brownist, Antinomian, Barrowist, Roundhead, and Separatist. This act was agreed to by the General Assembly and passed into law. Although the act would be repealed and repassed and repealed again, it proved to be an important precedent. It didn't exactly separate church and state, but it was a step in that direction. While these new understandings were being hashed out in the Chesapeake, more immediately consequential things were happening back in the mother country. The war had gone increasingly poorly for the king, and in 1646 Charles was captured and taken prisoner by the parliamentary forces. But that didn't end the conflict. Charles still had supporters, and even while in prison he was able to remain in contact with them, plotting further resistance and trying to get himself freed. His efforts were all unsuccessful, though, and in the end, they doomed him. The parliamentary faction had become fed up. Any remaining love they had for their monarch had gone. His continued scheming seemed proof that he could never be trusted and that he would break any agreement he made. Charles seemed less an agent of God on earth than of the devil. In the end, Parliament took the unprecedented, and to many sacrilegious, step of having the king tried for treason. It was legally questionable whether the king, who embodied the nation, could even in principle be guilty of treason. And the trial, before Parliament itself, was a politicized show trial. But none of that mattered. Charles needed to die, and so he was found guilty and sentenced to death. He was beheaded on January 30th, 1649. At the beginning of the war, no one had wanted this outcome. The goal was never to overthrow the monarchy, it was simply to enforce each side's vision of what the balance of power should be. But over the last near-decade of fighting, things eventually reached a breaking point. And there seemed to be no going back. Soon after the execution, a republic was declared, the Commonwealth of England. One of Parliament's most successful generals, the Puritan Oliver Cromwell, was put in charge. The theaters were shut down and celebrations of Christmas were banned. England was again religiously remade. There was yet another rebellion, this one led by Charles's son, Charles II, but he was defeated by Parliament as well. He was forced to run, at one point hiding in a tree to avoid capture before escaping to the continent. England was to remain a Puritan-dominated republic. For now. The settlers of the Chesapeake followed all of these happenings with intense concern and increasing dismay. Upon the execution of Charles I, the Virginia Assembly declared its allegiance to his now exiled son, Charles II, and issued a statement denouncing the, quote, unparalleled treasons perpetrated, divesting the king of those rights which the law of nature and nations and the known laws of the kingdom of England have adjudged inherent to his royal line, and the law of God himself, if sacred writ may be so styled, which this age doth loudly call in question, hath consecrated unto him. In other words, the Virginians were declaring themselves to be as royalist as you could be, endorsing the monarchy's divine right to rule. They even declared that anyone openly supporting the execution of Charles would be tried as an accessory after the fact. In 1650, the English government responded to these provocations. First, they attempted to block trade with Virginia, but this was an empty gesture without any force to back it up. However, in late 1651, the English scraped together a fleet to subdue Virginia and bring it under parliamentary control. William Claiborne was one of the leaders of the expedition. He'd been back in England for a little while now. The fleet first stopped at the English colony of Barbados in the Caribbean and secured control there. Then it went on to the Chesapeake. There was a tense standoff between Berkeley and the parliamentary expedition as the fleet made its way towards Jamestown. Berkeley called up 1,000 militiamen to guard the capital. But no one actually wanted bloodshed and no shots were fired. It was more of a show of force to help ensure a reasonable settlement. A truce was agreed to and terms of surrender were worked out. The English weren't looking to punish the Virginians. Berkeley was removed from office, of course, but he was allowed to keep his lands and he could stay in Virginia if he chose, which he did. Property rights were respected, and no real effort was made to impose Puritan beliefs on the colony. And perhaps most importantly, trade with England was restored in full. All in all, a generous settlement. Parliament simply didn't want to expend more effort on Virginia than was necessary. Parliament had neglected to include instructions as to how Virginia was now to be governed, so a temporary agreement was hashed out. The colony was allowed to keep the General Assembly so long as the previous anti-parliamentary legislation was repealed. But actually, the House of Burgesses was given even more power than before. There was no longer a king to appoint governors or councillors, so those posts would now be appointed directly by the Burgesses. In other words, elected officials were now the ultimate source of all political power in Virginia. Parliament could send another fleet if the colony got too out of line, but everyone hoped to avoid that. This was a very radical thing to do in such a low-key way, although things had been done similarly in England for a while now. Virginia was being left to rule itself in a quite democratic fashion, at least until Parliament came up with a new plan. But Parliament had its own problems to deal with, and Virginia would keep this temporary form of government for the rest of the decade. So, Virginia had been subdued, but what about Maryland? Well, Maryland wasn't actually included as part of their mission, perhaps thanks to the intervention of Lord Baltimore. Instead, the fleet's instructions were to, quote, "Upon your arrival in Virginia, reduce all the plantations within the Bay of Chesapeake to their due obedience to the Parliament and the Commonwealth of England." Maryland wasn't mentioned, only Virginia was. But whatever the intent of the instructions had been, the ambiguous wording gave William Claiborne an opening to attack Maryland yet again. Within a few weeks of the submission of Virginia, he took a contingent 70 miles north to St. Mary's City and, yet again, overthrew the government. But, yet again, he had overreached. Higher officials reversed his actions. The old proprietary government under Lord Baltimore was soon back in place, and the old governor restored to his post. The government of Maryland was of course now expected to remain loyal to Parliament, but otherwise things went back to the way they were before. So that's where things stood in 1652. Despite all the commotion and despite all the bloodshed back in England, things hadn't really changed too much in the Chesapeake. Berkeley was out as governor, and Maryland's growth had been hindered by instability, but there had been no radical revolutions in government. The colonies answered to a new master, but were still mostly left to their own devices. Virginia especially became even more independent. As we'll see in the next episode, this was partly just because England was still preoccupied with its own affairs. And also remember that the colonies were in fact still quite small and unimportant. The high death rate kept the population low and the economy stagnant. The Chesapeake was a backwater. The English possessions in the Caribbean, especially Barbados, were richer, more developed, and a higher priority overall. But also, I think that part of the reason was that Virginia had come up with a style of government that worked for its unique situation. They were 4,000 miles and several months of travel away from England, so most decisions simply had to be made locally. Which is obvious enough. And relatively representative government made sense, given that Virginia was still relatively egalitarian. There were only a few thousand settlers in the Chesapeake, which was simply not yet large enough to support the sort of hereditary aristocracy that existed in England. Virginia was becoming more stratified, but that process was still underway. Giving all the free men a voice in government made perfect sense at this point. So the elections kept going, despite the change in management. Representative government in Virginia had survived the English Civil War. Next episode, we'll discuss the history of the Chesapeake across the 1650s, during the rule of Oliver Cromwell. This decade would see Virginia remain calm, while the government in Maryland would be overthrown a further 2 or 3 times, depending on how you count. There's more excitement to come, so join me next time on Early and Often, the history of elections in America.